Good morning, everyone. As Elena Ballina was saying, I am Alida Sangrigoli from Politecnico di Torino, and I'm going to present a research on Chinese FDI in Africa. So we chose this topic because, as all of you know, China is has emerged as a major global player in the last decades. And this is also reflected in the outward investment policy, Chinese outward investment policy. China first started to open its economy to foreign investments in the late 70s, but only on a limited base, with only some state-owned enterprises investing abroad. Then progressively more and more, in late 1990s with the global strategy, and more recently with the One Belt, One Road strategy. This strategy also includes African investments in Africa.
Can I ask whether those data come from UNCTAD or where?
These ones come from the UNCTAD database of FDI, so it's the aggregate Chinese FDI flows worldwide from 2017. While these data showing just Chinese inflows in FDI inflows in African countries are only referring to greenfield FDIs from 2003 to 2017 and are retrieved from the FDI markets database. As you can see, Chinese FDI in greenfield FDI in Africa increased by almost 5 times in the last 15 years. Our research questions for this analysis are: what are the drivers behind the Chinese investments in Africa, and if these drivers are different for Chinese and non-Chinese investors? The literature on the main location factors, on the determinants of investments in developing countries, identify some factors that affect the most the investment decisions, which are usually natural resource availability, the market size and growth, the openness of the economy to trade and investment, the economic stability of the economy, and the institutional quality and the cost and quality of labor. Some other variables, the role of some other factors are instead more controversial. For example, the role of bilateral investment treaties and other international investments agreements. When it comes to Africa, the empirical evidence on the determinants of the investments in Africa is very scarce. It is very scarce, especially on some topics, which are the role of BIT and other investment agreements, and also the different role, the different determinants of investment for different sectors and industry activities, and also depending on the origin of investors and other firm-related and firm investment level characteristics. So when we go to analyze the specific determinant, the specific drivers behind the Chinese investment in Africa, the evidence is even scarcer, and also the evidence on Chinese investment is very mixed. Some parts of the literature identify the natural resource availability as the most important factor attracting Chinese investments. Also, Chinese investments are thought to be most attracted by riskier and weaker institutional contexts. So contexts characterized by countries with higher political instability and more corrupt environments. But, however, another part of the literature find that the drivers behind Chinese and non-Chinese, in particular Western investors, are similar. So both kind of investors are attracted, yes, by natural resources, but natural resources are just one among many other factors, such as market size and the others that I listed before. When we want to analyze as I said before, the different determinants for different sectors of investments or different activities of investment, the evidence is almost inexistent. So our contribution is this, to analyze, to use firm-level data, the most recent firm-level data, to empirically investigate the determinants of Chinese FDI in Africa. We are taking into consideration only greenfield FDI in different industrial activities, including co-location factors in the analysis, so the effect of previous investment of the same firm in the same country. We are also among the few to investigate the Chinese propensity to rely on investment agreements, international investment agreements like bilateral investment treaties. To do this, we use discrete choice models to model the probability for a country for an investment to be located in a given country. So in this model, the probability that location I is chosen by an investor yields the highest utility compared to all the other possible locations. So the key advantage of this model is that we can study the location choice for each individual investment project. In this model, the dependent variable is a binary variable, that is the variable choice, which equals 1 if the investment is located in the specific country I, and 0 otherwise. The set of regressors include country-specific determinants accounting for the standard factors of locations, the one that I listed before, so natural resources, market size and growth, availability and quality of labor, institutional quality, and agglomeration economies. We also included bilateral variables, dyadic variables, to account for geographic proximity or distance, but also institutional and cultural distance. We included 2 dummies to account for the international investment agreements, one for bilateral investment treaties and another from other treaties with investment provisions. And then, the most important part, our variables of interest are the main effects of co-location of the same firm. So the co-location, by co-location we mean the previous location of the same firm in the same country, and also specific agglomeration economies from the same country of origin. So previous investments from the same country of origin in the same country of destination. We also are interested, as our main variables of interest, in the interaction terms between China and the main regressors to account for the differential effects of the regressors for Chinese and non-Chinese investors. We had also a dummy for South Africa to take into account that South Africa attracts the 22 of the investments of in our sample. Then in our data set, all time variant regressors are lagged 1 year to mitigate simultaneity problems. We chose to include a wide set of location-specific and dyadic regressors to reduce the risk of omitted variables. So our data set, thus constructed, includes more than 8,000 greenfield FDI into 35 African countries from 2003 to 2017. Of these, 329 are Chinese investments. So the data sources for this analysis is the FDI markets database from the Financial Times for the greenfield FDI, while the standard location regressors were retrieved from the World Development Indicators and the World Governance Indicators of the World Bank, the International Investment Agreements data from the UNCTAD Investment Policy Hub, and the bilateral variables from the CEPI database of the University of Paris. Of course, this study has some limitations that are given by the quality of the data available, especially for Africa. and also the limited number of Chinese investments, so the limited sample. Here we are going to, I want to show you some descriptives to better understand the composition of investments, both from Chinese and non-Chinese investors. So these are the main country of origins investing in Africa. We are always talking about greenfield investments from 2003 to 2017. We can see that United States is the first investor in Africa with around 13% of investments, while China, there is much talk about Chinese investments in Africa growing more and more. But if we consider the whole period, China is only the 9th investor.
Could you define the Chinese investments in Africa as greenfield? So they are more building infrastructure. These are not classified as greenfield investments, I guess. Usually they are building, I don't know, harbors, highways in order to connect a mine to extract
usually
resources and then bring them back to China. These are not classified as greenfield, I guess.
Yes, greenfield investors are all.
They are.
You want to explain?
So we have information we have information. She's going to show it in a moment, the composition, but we do have information about whether the investment is in construction or in extraction, for instance. So we really
because I thought that greenfield was like if you build a plant, like more or less produce the same operation, the same operation as yours, and then
no.
Thanks.
Greenfield investment is the creation of a new firm in the destination.
But I always thought it was more related to firms and not to infrastructure.
No, also to infrastructure. I'm going to show it in a really few minutes. What I wanted to show here is that Africa is only, if we consider the whole period, China is only the 9th investor in Africa, but we can see that this is the share of Chinese greenfield FDI on the total. We can see that the share has significantly increased in the whole period, so that in 2017, at the end of the period, China was the 4th investor in Africa for greenfield FDI. So these are the activities of investment. We can see that Chinese investments are for almost the half in manufacturing, while non-Chinese investors invest more or less the same amount. Here we are talking about number of investments, not the amount. So the same number of investment in manufacturing, in business services, and in sales, marketing, and support services. So you can see that the construction is here. Is also present. It's not really. It's true that China is known for its construction projects, but as number of investments, these are just a small part of Chinese investments in Africa.
Do they do the same in terms of amount of money spent? Do you have information on
We have information in the database, but we still have to. Yes.
Preliminary inspection of the data, the picture changes pretty much because, of course, the construction and extraction the investments are larger investments on average. But here we focus on numbers.
And later, I'm going to show you the result of the empirical analysis, where we also disaggregated the data using groups of industry activities. And we, as groups, we used the blue, the manufacturing one. The second group is services that includes the ones that here are red, orange, so sales, marketing, and support, business services, and retail. And then the resource-based group of activities, the primary activities that are extraction, electricity, and constructions, because they are more resource-based. Looking at the destinations of the investments, we can see that South Africa is the first destination country in Africa for both Chinese and non-Chinese investors, accounting for more than 20% of investments. We can also see that in both cases, 4 destinations account for more than half of total number of investments. So we can say that the FDI are quite concentrated in terms of destination countries, in few destination countries that are also more or less the same for Chinese and non-Chinese investors. So these are the results of our the results of our baseline analysis. In our baseline specification, we did not distinguish between industry activities. So we considered the aggregate amount of FDI. What we found, first we included in the regression only the standard regressors of the usually considered in the analysis of the determinants, so natural resources, market size, and so on and so forth, and also the investment agreements. In the second, then we added also the previous investments from the same country and the previous investments from the same industry, the same firm, so the collocation effect. Then we added the interaction effects to account for the differential effects of the regressors for Chinese and non-Chinese investors. And we added a column for the effects the effects only for China. So what we find is that most regressors have the expected signs and are highly significant. For example, natural resources and market size growth are, as expected, positively impacting on the probability to receive investments. We also find that, investment agreements do promote FDI, while the effect for China is not significant. And then we also find that the access to information about the location that is proxied by the collocation and the previous investments from the same country matters for the whole sample. Collocation also matters for China, but we find here in the interaction effects that Chinese investors rely significantly less on collocation. Then we explored the heterogeneity of our results of our sample by industry activities. So, as I was saying before, disaggregating for manufacturing activities, services activities, and primary related, resource-related activities. What we find is that the location determinants appear heterogeneous across function, that the main results show that previous investments from the same firm and the same country do have an effect, but that Chinese investors react to this collocation differently depending on the sector on the activity of investment. We can see here that from the interaction term in services that Chinese investors rely significantly less on collocation in services activities, while they rely significantly more on collocation for primary activities, primary sector activities. We interpret this result using also previous literature published on the world development on the different activities of investment, in which they suggest that primary sector activities carry higher risk of expropriation and higher sunk cost, so that collocation is an important factor to protect as a protection against these risks. while instead of using other tools such as investment treaties. While for services where this is not, these costs are not high, the factor of co-location is significantly less important for China. We also, from this disaggregated analysis, we can also see that the resource.
Sorry, just to understand, the Chinese buy land in Africa. This is part of the primary effect, and they buy land where also other foreign countries buy land.
The co-location refers. Co-location refers to the previous investment of the same firm, of the same firm, in the same activity.
I was thinking international because the property rights is different if you go against China or you go against the United States in Europe, and so that's the reason why I was thinking that this co-location of a general foreign direct investment, not of Chinese but all the other partners.
This is captured in this FDI stock.
Yes.
Which you have there. This is the stock, so FDI token and you also have bilateral FDI from China, but not necessarily from that firm. So with the three levels.
While the co-location wants to catch the effect of the same firm, of the previous investment of the same firm, also in other activities. So.
Probably have more stronger network of connections.
Just understanding.
That
5 minutes?
Yes, that was the idea behind. We also find, I'm actually concluding, we also find that in manufacturing activities, Chinese investors are more attracted by natural resources, while in service activities they are more attracted by, as we can see by the interaction term, by the market size. Surprisingly, we find that in the primary sector activities, they are more attracted by human capital. So human capital is a factor specifically affecting investments in the Chinese investments in the primary sector. If you have some suggestions, some comment on this particular result, it is very well accepted, and also on other results. So to conclude, we studied the determinants of Chinese investments in Africa. We find that similar location factors attract Chinese and non-Chinese investors, but Chinese investors rely significantly less on co-location. A possible explanation in general could be that, since Chinese firms investing abroad are mostly state-owned enterprises, they have support from their own state, and so they have less need for a co-location factor, for co-location. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Quick question, a quick suggestion. Am I right in understanding that all your data are based on the number of FDI and not on the values?
Yes, so far, yes.
And the suggestion is do it, because you might find some interesting differences, and then you compare them. And I think it shouldn't take too much time if you have already the database, because in the database of the foreign direct investment you have both the values and the numbers. So since the model, which is very interesting, by the way, I mean, the whole work you have done, I think it would be very interesting, because for instance, the Chinese case is a case in point. They do a lot of infrastructure, etc. So the value, so the share will be bigger. And the second small question was, when you talked about the data on 2003, 2013, 2014, such a share? Is it the stocks or the flows of 2017?
The flows.
Of the 70?
Yes.
Okay, but the flows of 1 year, it's not so interesting, is it?
Yes, if you take it alone, but I was thinking that showing the share of.
It would be more interesting to see, okay, that period, the flows, the sum of the flows were more, and then look at the stocks.
Okay.
Which takes into account also years before.
Yes, I will certain.
Lower the place of China, of course, because last China. Okay.
We will certainly do that.
About infrastructure, maybe I think as it's not that much important, maybe because really it is true. I've been working a bit about it, and it's true that there is a lot of work, of course, by Chinese on infrastructural sectors, particularly I would say energy and transport. But it's not that much about investment or indirect investment, but maybe more about the official finance and funding, bilateral funding from the Chinese government to the African countries' government, as these are public goods and typically public sectors. So I'm not sure how much they. And another area where you find a lot of Chinese involvement in infrastructure is for construction, but in this case, I mean, because the government has money from the government itself or from other foreign partners like the World Bank, they make tender, and then the company which wins, which gets the bid is from China, and they work, they construct the infrastructure. Here the flow is the other way around because it is payment from Africa to the African government to the Chinese firm, can be sometimes from the Chinese government to the African government and then back to the Chinese firm, but it is a kind of another story, I would say. So it is huge and you have important things going on there, but not necessarily that relevant. Of course, you check with the value, this will be confirmed, but well, it's very interesting the share of manufacturing also will be, because this is the investment which is has more potential when you look at structural change for African countries. It's also very interesting. This was my comment, which was long, sorry. But my question was about, you mentioned institutional quality.
Yes.
And but I'm not sure if I got it, which was the result. I mean, is it...
Actually, we did a... I go? Wait.
The results and institute should be we experimented a little bit.
Qua. No, sorry. This one.
Political stability. We have experimented with several of these governance indicators. We picked up political stability. Here the results are very similar for rule of law and control of corruption. What is interesting is that we were expecting, because some literature was saying this, we were expecting a smaller effect of institutional quality for Chinese investors, because this is somewhat discourse about Chinese investments in Africa. And we actually did find such a result when we omitted the inflation. When we included a control for inflation, any specific interaction effects of political stability with China disappeared. And so it appears that there is this correlation between clearly institutional quality and inflation, which makes sense. So we don't find, let's say, the implication that we find is that there is no specific distinctive effect of institutional quality for Chinese investors, which is somehow unexpected. But yeah, this is what we, at this point we are somehow convinced of this result because we were looking for it and did not find it.
Still, it's also a kind of result, maybe, because for other investors it is a driver, for Chinese it's not, but then you should control it one by one.
As I said, we experimented also with rule of law. goods wars. So yes, yeah, that's right. But yeah, in a way we are anyway. The results are not so much driven by the sort of indications.
Okay, thank you. We have questions from Francesco, Augusto, Vittorio, and Kim. So maybe you collect all their questions and then you answer. So
Okay.
you can speed up a little bit. So,
Among the various
Francesco.
determinants on FDI, have you considered the phenomenon of tariff jumping? Because this will be quite relevant in many African countries where the average tariff rates are quite high. Then it would be interesting to see if there is a difference between the attraction of this high level of tariffs for Chinese investors and not Chinese investors.
That's a very good point.
Augusto?
Simple question. Do you try to utilize the Orbis database as well?
For MN,
Vittorio?
It's a good reply.
In your research project, there is also a consideration of the difference between Chinese investment and other investment as regard the labor force utilized, because important difference for some other research are that Chinese utilize quite a high percentage of teleworkers in China, for instance, infrastructure projects and so on. And they utilize only a small part of the domestic labor force. And also, the technological transfer of knowledge is much less for this reason in some sectors that has been certain by others.
And last question is
yes, just very simple question about the manufacturing sector that you said before, which is the most important field where Chinese investors invest in Africa. Do you know exactly which industry they are investing in? I mean, like, which is the most important industry in manufacturing that they are doing some investments?
okay, so you answer quickly answer.
yes, regarding the tariff jumping, we are going to work on that. It's in our work agenda, so it's a very good point, very relevant for both China and Africa. With regards to the Orbis database, Orbis is both greenfield and brownfield investments, right? So in this part of the work we focused on greenfield FDI, but I don't know if we maybe are going also to move to considering
You have money.
brownfield FDI if we have money. So with regards to the comment on the labor, yes, actually the labor part of the variables is always the most, for Africa is the most difficult, because there are no very many good data on the labor force, also on the wage levels in different sectors and in different countries. So it would be very interesting also to understand how the different compositions, or the different composition of the labor force used depends also on affects also the labor as a factor, as a determinant. So yes, and with regard to technological transfer, we are going to face that issue. I think when we move to the effects of the FDI in Africa, while so far we are on the determinants, on the first part of the determinants. Manufacturing, here we use data on the industry activities, so it just indicates manufacturing. There's the possibility to go deeper in the analysis of subsectors. We could not further split the sample, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do the analysis with a smaller sample.